Good evening, everybody that's just joining us. I apologize for the link issue, but yeah. So, Maria, we'll just give you the floor if you want to
Okay,
just start.
that's great. Thank you, everyone. And thanks so much to the Youth 2000 team and to create this culture series I've managed to catch some of the YouTube videos, and it's been wonderful to have a very theological reflection on big, big issues that I think when I talk to my friends, and I'm sure all of us do, contemplate about um, the state of the world, particularly in a particular epoch time of the world where we have time to hopefully reflect on where we are, why we're here, and what's the meaning of all this. Um, During this time this past year, I've also had the privilege to work on a lot of things that the Pope has done with regards to the environment. So, my name is Maria Carvalho. I come from India and Canada, but I've grown up in Saudi Arabia and I've lived in London for the past 14 years when I first came to do my master's. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of background on that journey to what I'm doing today. So, right now, I'm a consultant for a climate action company. So, we do climate solutions. We figure out how to invest into climate projects, and we figure out how to make that business case for businesses to invest into these projects and to benefit, while also businesses themselves decarbonize their own emissions. It's been very exciting to work there for the past 2 years. But prior to that, I've mostly worked in research on climate policy, essentially. But to kind of understand how I got there, it's worth taking some steps back, which is my undergrad in Canada was in economic development. And I had a very clear reason of why I wanted to do international development and economics, because any international development student will tell you that the reason why you go into studying this degree is because you want to save the world. You graduate that degree thinking anything you do will ruin the world. It's educated you to be very, very critical of all previous attempts. Um, the reason why I wanted to study international development was because I do come from India, but I grew up in another country which was, in comparison, economically more prosperous. And for me, going back to India was a very harsh and stark reality of real poverty. To see a child who looks like you, like legitimately, um, how often when I would land into Bombay, flying over slums, land in there, and then you would go and take the taxi to go to our family house. And on the way, the amount of children I'd see looking like me, weaving through the traffic, carrying a little child. Most of the times they were semi naked. It is a really heartbreaking scene. But it's also something that it's not to romanticize poverty at all. That's not the point. It's just that it released something in me, a kind of awareness of our common responsibility to those who are not as privileged as us. And truly, I will say it was a Holy Spirit thing of a real love for the poor that was there. And I was really lucky to have two people in my life. I mean, I've had many people in my life, but two people in my life. One is my uncle, Reji, who's also a father. He's a diocesan priest in Calcutta, and he works a lot with the poor in the slums of Calcutta. And so through him, I got to learn a lot about the poor in a place like India. But I also and I also worked with him in India. So I used to, for the last 2 summers of my undergraduate degree, I would go to Calcutta and work with him because he was actually taking care of the Archbishop of Calcutta's social development program. And we used to go into the field and I would, evaluate flood and disaster preparation, which is actually quite impressive in these villages, what they would do in order when a cyclone would hit. But that kind of work got me very excited about the environment because when you work in the environment, you suddenly realize how interconnected poverty and environment are. So when I graduated from my undergraduate degree in Queens, I really wanted a much more clear moral compass, if that's at all possible. So I decided environment would be that key thing. And so I went to the London School of Economics in 2006 to do a master's in environmental policy and regulation. Now, the reason why I mention that is because that was a very seminal year. 2006 was the year when three major things happened. One was the International Panel of Climate Change had released their report on climate change that really showed that the climate science was indisputable, that human interaction, or basically, I'm going to put less technical terms. It's so nice to not talk in climate speak, but just basically human activities actually release to through fossil fuel combustion, but also not just fossil fuel combustion, but like the way we do agriculture, the way we do farming, the way we cut down forests. Um, all of this actually leads to way too many greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere, and it does create a warming effect. And that warming effect has major changes in the ecological system, not just the climatic system, but the ecological system. And more since 2006, we've seen the International Panel on Climate Change show that scientific basis. But 2006 was also the year, and the International Panel on Climate Change had actually started in 1989. So, it was with climate scientists showing and building evidence and gathering that evidence and synthesizing that evidence. So what the IPCC reports actually are a synthesis, the most biggest literature review of scientific studies that are peer reviewed, that then show what the consensus is on climate science. Now, what made 2006 seminal when we talk about climate change is two other things came out. One was The Inconvenient Truth, which is a documentary by Al Gore, something I'd seen right before I came to London. And that sparked my imagination of something that was beyond, like how our own actions have massive consequences when we're within the current economic system that we're in. And when I went to LSE, another major report came out, which I don't know if you could, I'll share with you a pint if you know this guy. Well, now I've seen it, but it's the economics of climate. Can you see a screen with LSE and Grantham? Yeah, okay, great. So this report was very seminal because it was the first time there was a real rigorous academic study that was policy oriented towards climate change. So far, we'd only gotten science, but we hadn't gotten the policy side. And so the economics of climate change, commissioned by the Treasury, it was actually quite seminal in that way of actually enabling. It was very seminal in finally having a policy-oriented approach to dealing with climate change, not just about the science. And in that way, it set out key principles on what is climate change, but what is the policy-oriented approach. I've had the privilege since that time of graduating, of working in a company that actually tracked renewable energy investments and carbon markets. After that, I then went in to do my PhD at basically this place at LSE in the Grantham Research Institute, which was led by Nicholas Stern. So he's in the climate world, he's a bit of a rock star. A lot of people are very jealous when I say that, yes, I've shared the elevator with him, or I knew his research assistants. Like, it's a big deal in that case. But one of the things that is relevant for our talk is just Nicholas Stern's encounter with the Pope. So this report came out in 2006. It had galvanized actually a lot of movement in climate change. By 2008, the UK had passed something called the Climate Change Act, which set out a long-term carbon reduction target by 2050, 80 to 95%. The UK has since, as of last year, updated and passed the legislation to make that target now net zero by 2050. What the UK has provided in terms of climate legislation, not just climate legislation, but how it's implemented, the types of institutions you put in place, has been replicated by many countries. Now, it's been very exciting to be part of the Grantham Research Institute because a lot of my professors worked on this report, on the Stern Review. A lot of the people I ended up working with at LSE, and especially with this institute, I got to work with and learn from them and see how the course of climate change legislation has changed since then. So for me, what I want to qualify first is that I am not a theologian. I'm a social scientist. I have seen how this debate both in terms of its science, but in terms of the policies, in terms of the economics, and even the social science, has really come together. And I've been, what I would say, in the dogfight with it in terms of research, I would say more, and also providing policy submissions to the UK government, to different EU governments. I've also, as part of the Foreign Commonwealth Office, been taken on a research trip to Alberta, which is where I grew up in Canada, and to speak to them about that. Now, the reason why I kind of give this preface is that I do come from a social science point of view, but I'm also a Catholic. And when I had the chance to read Laudatio Si, I felt it provided a very key narrative that wasn't there before, and in such a way that was so simple. And I'm not the only one who thought that. So Nick Stern, who you see up there, who's right here, he actually did advise the Pope on the writing of Laudatio Si, and he presented to the Catholic Society in LSC after it was published on his sort of reflections. And one of the things that he said that I thought was rather sweet was, he said, you know, I've worked in climate change, and my father would roll in his grave because he's a confirmed atheist. But my father would roll in his grave if he ever heard me say that I love this Pope. Now, the reason why Nick Stern says that is because he said what the Pope has managed to do is to take very complex ideas and put it in such a way that is simple and accessible, but still meaningful. And I just want to kind of give you an impression of what I mean by that. So I have a couple of books that have now become my, now actually are the things that my computer monitor rests on, just to give it some elevation. So here's one, Handbook on Energy and Climate Change. Very, very important book that my friend has written and compiled from very leading academics. So just see how thick that is. Another one on a journalist who is exposed actually how palm oil destruction or the creation is really draining the trees in Malaysia. And then this one on Phoenix cities, which is about the rise and fall of great former industrial cities. Now, these all, if you were to put that, all of these books are very in-depth, provide very good insight. But interestingly enough, this is Laudatio Si. This is the Pope's book on climate change. Look how simple it is. I've had a privilege to have to go through all of these kinds of books. I wasn't surprised, but I was really happy to be able to read something that didn't dumb down the issues, but made it meaningful. And that is what I think, meaningful in a way that doesn't lead to a sense of hopelessness. I'll add that second bit. There are definitely people who are very, very passionate about climate change as we know it. But what I feel as if when I read Laudatio Si was that sense of meaning when you put God at the center of what we do. And so what I would say is that there's three key messages I want to provide. And just my three key reflections of what I think is missing. And I'd really love to share with you. We can definitely have Q&A after. But the first one I would say is most books when it comes to climate change and talking about climate change, this is the International Panel of Climate Change report, the latest one. It will show you things like this, right? Basically, how the world is going to suffer when we experience climate change. It will show you graphs like this, what it means in global mean sea level rise. It'll show you average surface temperature changes. It will give you very important evidence. But how does Laudatio Si start? And for me, this is the thing that makes it very beautiful. It talks about Laudatio Si. I'm going to try and see if people can unmute themselves, but does anyone know what Laudatio Si means? You want to try? Give it 10 seconds. Okay, well, it's not climate change. If you were thinking it was climate change in Latin, it's not. Laudatio Si means praise to you, Lord God. It is what Saint Francis actually said. And so the entire book is Laudatio Si on care for our common home. And I think what makes this incredibly beautiful is that it brings us back to nature, but the beauty of nature, and actually giving praise to it. And I think there's something so much more inspiring about us remembering that. So I'm going to show you a few pictures that when I saw it, when I came upon these encounters, it took my breath away, but it made me realize, it put me in a space of being in awe of creation. So the first one is this. Now, this is my favorite lake in the entire world. I would challenge you to find a more beautiful lake. This is in Alberta, in Canada. It's Lake Maureen. I've given a nighttime view. In the day, it's spectacular, the blue, and I've only seen it in the daytime. Now that I know pictures like this exist, I will definitely see it at the nighttime. But for me, the way Laudatio Si starts off is with praise to God, the creator of all creation. And it is in that sense of taking us back into why the environment matters, but in a way that just wants to take your breath away. I always am moved whenever I go to Lake Maureen. Every time I go to Alberta, I force people to take me to Lake Maureen just so when I walk in, I am automatically in praise of God, the creator. Other ones is sometimes when I don't have to go that far away. This is in Hampstead Heath. I live very close to it. I loved this picture and I love this tree every time I see it because I don't know about you, I can't think of a tree doing a better praise to God than that one. I come from India, so we have this pose called, like in yoga, they do this pose called Surya Namaskar, and that's pretty much what it is, a big salute to God. Here's another one about understanding how even creation, I mean, I was very fanciful when I took this picture of this dog because I just thought it was looking up, and I'm sure it was looking at a bird, but I felt it was just so in communion with nature. And here's just another place that when I was out on doing field research and field project work in Colombia, this was earlier this year, it was just those places. And so I just want to take 10 seconds for you to take yourself back to, or you can even, if anyone wants to be brave enough, just tell me one time when you walked somewhere, you were immersed in nature and you felt in awe of it. And let me know if you felt God in that space as well. Anyone want to share their stories?
I'll go, Maria. So my auntie lives in a ski resort in Switzerland. They moved out there maybe 10 years ago. And for us, every time I go there, you're just, and it's not an industrialized ski resort at all. It's still very natural. There's a lot of restrictions on the building, so it looks as natural as possible. Everything's in wood. And when I'm just up there on the top of the mountain and overlooking all the other mountains in the Alps, it just creates that awe of the beauty of creation and also how small I am, which is what I love most about it. But every time, like summer, winter, autumn, whenever, I'm just absolutely blown away at the beauty of going there. So that's, yeah.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's such a wonderful story. It is true. Like I'll say this. One of the things that always not annoys me, I understand why people do it. They talk about climate change and they talk about all the disasters, and it enables a sense of urgency. And we do need to take urgent climate action. But I loved how this book started off with acknowledging the beauty of nature and the beauty of creation. Actually, there's a very important message that the Pope points out here, which is not just nature. He makes a distinction between creation and nature. So creation is created by the creator. And with that, you see it's God's gift to us. It's God's gift out of his love. which is a really powerful thing when you come across something of fantastic beauty, that you realize it is a good in and of itself. While with nature, the distinction that's done in Laudato Si is that it's something that can be studied. It's something that can be understood, and it's something that can be used. And in fact, that utilitarian approach in social sciences, we call a natural capital. And when you see these kinds of discourses, you see a kind of utilitarian approach, but not that is heavily criticized by other types of environmental discourses, that nature is good in and of itself. But what I love about Laudato Si is it tells, it's the very title is Praise Be to God. And it is about a praise for God and its creation and the good of it. But what's very important about that is then really God's command for us to till and keep it. He does give us dominion, but that dominion comes with environmental stewardship. So the other thing that this book very much clears up is that just because we have dominion doesn't mean we get to exploit it. We get to till and keep it, which is a very different notion of exploitation. And so it is in that wonder that goes to the second message that I think is really important, which is, why are we where we are now? Which is in a point of such ecological destruction that we are coming to a point of disharmony. Now, again, in the social scientists, we'll talk about economic systems. We'll talk about industrialization. We'll talk about even societal shifts and values. All of these, I think, are very important. We'll talk about technological progress. We'll critique it in certain ways. We'll talk about how poverty leads to a vicious cycle of destruction. It will be heartbreaking, but we don't bring it all together. And the thing that I've been contemplating this a lot as social scientists. So one of the definitions I have of a social scientist is basically a psychologist for society. We go under the hood and we understand societal relations, and we try to understand why society works in the way it does. I would charge that it's a lot more challenging than being able to put things in a lab and to do control tests because you can't do that on humans. You trying to test why social relations are the way they are, why society is organized the way it is, why economic systems are organized the way it is. You know, there's a new term in social science which is called interdisciplinary. We recognize that things are integrated, but the social sciences tends to be they stick to their discipline, they stick to their methodologies. There's not as much integration that would be needed in explaining why things are wrong. Now, it's not something that I do like, again, the message within Laudato Si is that why are we where we are? And he points to this notion of sin. Now, this is not just like sin in whichever ways, is that sin in the discourse of there's a brokenness with us. We have broken a relationship that is very key and integral to who we are as a human being, to the way God has created us, our relationship with God, our relationship with creation. That is where the rupture happens, our relationship with other. So creation is not just nature, its creation is also people. It's that notion of knowing that with sin comes disharmony and a sense of brokenness. We're constantly looking for something that we're trying to fulfill, and we're not at rest within ourselves. And there's all types of sin that is, I would say, a different way of saying economic systems have gone on overdrive. Technological progress has hurt people. There's too much inequality to the level of racial discrimination, things like that. There's different ways of saying that, but I do think it's helpful to thinking about these sins of pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, sloth. Because it's just a different way of talking about social scientific problems, but in a way that can be individual, but can also be scaled up. It can help really kind of come, like I said, as a social scientist, I like understanding the psychology of society. And I can't help but thinking, yes, there is a brokenness. And the thing that Laudato Si does very well is it doesn't put this brokenness just to technocratic solutions that is focusing on how to change the economic system and technological process. It goes to the heart of, you cannot, what it calls an integral ecology. We're all connected, everything is connected. And so it goes into that the environmental crisis cannot be separated from a social crisis. And that social crisis isn't just mass consumerism. It's about community relations breaking down. It's about kind of hyper individualism that leads to mass consumption. It is about, why are we going there? Why is suddenly the need to consume so much more important? What has led to this ultimate individualism that potentially can make us a lot more self-centered? Than not needing to preserve family relations, community relations. How is it that we're having so much more polarization now than before? What led to that disruption? And so what I love about reading Laudato Si is that it points out to, we are broken, but you have to see the integration of all of it. That if we don't deal with the brokenness of dealing with poverty, you then cannot deal with environment. That unlike other things, and I'll agree with what he said here, is that normally when you read a lot of the climate change books, they will have a chapter on poverty. They will have a chapter on how it really affects people within the world. That term though is not very accessible. It's called intragenerational equity. So basically between generations or within generations. And then it talks about intergenerational equity, which is about future generations not benefiting from future generations inheriting a deteriorated environment, not just a climatic system, but a very deteriorated environment. These are not very accessible terms, but it's also chapters in a book. What's beautiful about Laudato Si is it brings it all together into what he calls an integral ecology. I think that comes back to the original message is that we're all created. So God is the creator, we are all created, and we are stewards of that creation. But in that stewardship of creation, sin has actually broken us in different ways. Broken us into the sense of our relationship with God, our value for ourselves as being true and good and beautiful, and then others as being true and good and beautiful. And that others is both humans and what I would say the environment. And putting that into right balance requires us to think, and as he goes to it, really helps us to think about, what are our values? And when we think about values, I cannot help but go back into, our values are shaped by what God has given us, by his commandments, by his sense of love. It's not just moral ethics that we drive, but it comes from a space of love. It doesn't come from sanctimony, it comes from love. We have these values in such a way to promote a common good. It's an orientation towards something that is beyond ourselves. And you cannot solve the ecological crisis if you do not solve poverty, if you do not pay attention to poverty. You cannot solve the ecological crisis if we do not pay attention to our own values and who we think we are within the grand scheme of things. And so I go back into what I tends to see in this. You're seeing so many more lonely people in the world. You're seeing so much more consumerism in the world. You're seeing a lot more individualism, but disconnectedness. You're seeing a lot more self-promotion on social media, while still people being disconnected to people within their homes, within their families. And so what I love about this is that it, in addressing what is the ways in which sin, manifests itself now, how do we then think about healing? And I go back into the hope of Christ, because Christ redeems. So that is actually another central message in thinking about redemption, is not all is lost. I've been working on climate change for 14 years, and I would say that when I talk to a lot of my secular friends, there is now a sense of despair. There's a real sense of depression. People are getting depressed by the notion of what's happening with climate change, with what the future is going to be inheriting. It's a sense of hopelessness because it seems, especially when you look at the graphs, we're not going to reach, well, basically, humanity will be destroyed. And I have to say, all said and done, I haven't had that sense of despair. I don't have the sense of naivete that we're not going to suffer. We already are seeing places in the world that are experiencing climate change. The ecosystem has changed, the climate system has changed. Their experience of cyclones is a lot more potent, a lot more frequent. So Hurricane Haiyan in Philippines in 2013 is a good example of that. That has been proven that yes, Haiyan would have occurred regardless of climate change, but the increased surface temperatures of water made it much more destructive. And we will see that more. So it's not a naive sense of, oh, we're going to avoid this. No, I'm fully accepting that we will be facing increasing temperatures and global average temperatures. We're going to experience more extreme events. But I almost feel as if it's now a reckoning. We've come to a point of reckoning that actually, that even Laudatio Si says is that, when you have this imbalance between humans and nature, nature does fight back. And we do see this kind of sense of a reckoning where we have to rethink things. And I'm seeing in so many ways political systems, messages from places in the world, that reckoning coming to pass. But it gives me hope because almost without a crisis, it's not the first time that the world has gone through these kinds of crises. But the hope comes from really a sense that ultimately God does come through. I know that seems crazy, but that's actually my orientation within myself, is that I know God loves us and I know he will keep his commandment and I know he will come through. And I know that coming through actually is our own conversions. So he talks in here, they talk about an ecological conversion, but I almost also say it's a spiritual conversion. It's a reorienting towards God. I've seen more and more people reorient away from God, and I feel as if it gives them a sense of meaninglessness. Now, this is just an observation. Like I said, I'm not a theologian, but I feel as if a sense of when people don't know that they are loved, and this is where I would put it there, that they are created, that there is a purpose for their life because God loved them into being. I don't know about you, but a lot of people seem to have an allergic reaction when I say that to them, when they're not, when they're atheist. But I love them anyways. I tell them that anyways. But it is moving when you know that you're created for a reason, that all creation is made for a reason. It reorients the way you see yourself and those around you. And it goes back into a sense of praise. You look for the simpler things, not the empty things that are going to keep you empty, but you keep thinking are going to make you happy, because that's what the world tells you. So it's a reorientation into, I feel that reorientation helps put you into a space of what's really important in the world, which is you being important, a sense of love for that, but then others are important, a sense of care for our common home, which recognizes that you do have stewardship, you do have impact. You think about your values, you think about these virtues. And in this case, the virtue of humility and sobriety are highlighted in Laudatio Si. I can't help but think that that is a really strong point in thinking about those virtues, about humility, about temperance, about kindness, about charity. The opposite of the sins amazingly can apply to things like climate change. So the opposite of the sin of our disruption with nature or in creation also could be where we find how our reorientation of our values can help us then see, how do we change our lifestyles? How do we pay attention to those who are poor, those who are disenfranchised, and put that in the center? How do we really think about and opening up perspective that doesn't mean like my naive undergrad studying international development, I'm going to save the whole world, which is actually we all come together towards our common home. And he talks about it in terms of the education of the covenant between humanity and the environment. I love that. I love this notion of there is a covenant, which means there is a responsibility, but it comes from a space of praise and worship. And that in and of itself makes you a lot more humble towards your approach, but also hopeful towards your approach. And what I would say is, one of the things I had last week to have the privilege to participate in is something called the Economy of Francesco. So the Pope just didn't write Laudatio Si and he left it there. He actually organized sometime last year, actually, he did a call out that he very much recognizes the youth, that this is their inheritance, but they also have a generosity of heart and also a willing spirit to actually tackle the problems of the world. And so what he did was called the Economy of Francesco, which is to get young economists, change makers, young people thinking about how they could solve a lot of these societal issues, but in a way that cares for our common home. It was meant to be if you were accepted, so about 2,000 people were invited. If they got to put their application. I luckily got to see it at the last minute, applied, got in, got to, it unfortunately didn't happen in March when it was supposed to because of COVID. So they deferred it to November in the hope we could all meet together in a CC. What is very interesting about that, unfortunately it went into Zoom, but we got to participate a few weeks ago. What was beautiful, actually, those little blessings that come in disguise, was that by having that 6 months between March and November, we had the time we had these things called villages. So it was specific, like life and lifestyle, finance and social responsibility, all these different things. It was very beautiful the way the themes were put into place, because it interwove in a very compelling way in which Laudatio Si talks about this integral ecology. But it was wonderful in that way of having the time for people from around the world, legitimately people from Philippines all the way out to Europe and Africa and North America and South America, all across the world. Every one of us who was supposed to meet in Assisi got to work together on different issues which were part of our villages. And we had the 6 months to come up with proposals. We had, in that time, we presented these proposals to the leading intellectuals. So Jeffrey Sachs, Kate Wayworth, powerhouses in their own right. And we had to come up with solutions for that. Different villages did, and they had that working program to really think, meditate, debate, work with people around the world, and present it. And since then, it has then led to a mission forward. So this is the Economy of Francesco. It is basically from those villages kind of provided a constitution, if you will, on what the young change makers have asked for from the different villages, where you can see the slowdown of the race. I love the way it starts. The great world powers and the great economic and financial institutions slow down their race to let the earth breathe. Other things on worldwide sharing of advanced technologies, stewardship of common goods, economic ideologies, decent work for all. I really have to say, I've been very impressed with people's commitment to that, but I've also been very impressed with what it meant. It's that it kind of brings back to this notion of the role of how someone like the Pope can galvanize an entire group of people, but give them the space to figure out those solutions, to bring a forum in which we come and work together. And these kind of working groups or villages and their proposals will continue to go forward, that the networks that were created from Economy of Francesco will be things that continue to have working programs. But the whole idea was, how do we implement this within our communities? How do we implement this within our society, within our work? How do we put proposals even to politicians for that? And so it provides that kind of galvanizing force that I feel has been missing that either when we talk about climate change, it's amongst a select group of people who get to work on it full time. It could be very local, but this is nice where we get people to work in networks, in communities, and try to scale up change. I'm going to end with just a prayer that was written for Laudatio Si. And I invite you to just reflect on the words. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth. And you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today, you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world towards the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love. For all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out, O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. And I'll leave it at that.
Wow, Maria, thank you so much. That prayer was so powerful. And everything that you shared was just eye-opening, I guess, for me in some capacity. Maybe I'm naive and don't really pay enough attention to the world, but thank you so much for sharing all that. I think we're going to take some time now for questions. So please, anybody and everybody ask questions, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion that comes from this. But thank you so much for sharing and for your wisdom and your knowledge and your heart also for the people. So
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I rarely get to talk about applying Catholic theology to my day-to-day work.
I can kick off the questions. I think, yeah, Maria, I just loved everything that you shared there. And I think we've talked about this a lot, and I just always appreciate everything you share. But I think something that maybe relates to other young people, but definitely is a thing for me, is sometimes this idea of, you know, saving the climate, like saving the environment, just feels sometimes like such a big task that you don't even know where to start. And especially, you know, I think as Catholics, you can think, well, actually, no, like focusing on the people is more important than focusing on the environment. But like you say, it all kind of ties together. So do you have like some easy tips or, you know, quick ways or easy ways to kind of really get started in making a difference in the small little ways
Yeah,
that
sure.
we can, yeah.
Well, so this is so one of the things I do is I'm part of the expert group on the BBC, and I kind of got into very interesting hot water about this. I mean, not in a way, it depends on who you are, but I would say maybe just to think about what we eat and just to give an understanding of how important that is. So there are 4 agricultural commodities that account for over 40%. I mean, it depends on what statistic you use, but is basically the prime drivers of deforestation in the world. So the one is the 4th one to the bottom is palm oil. The next one is timber and pulp. second one is soy. Now, before everyone gets on the case of vegetarians, actually what you may not realize is that 80% of soy is used for animal feed. So yeah, and what's a little bit more worrying is soy is the second biggest driver of deforestation in Brazil, but that animal feed goes and is exported to not just for South America, but to Asia and to Europe. Um, and then the first number one driver of deforestation, and by far, is beef. So this is not to say I'm telling everyone to stop eating beef. And it's what I'm saying is to think about, again, going back to that sense of values and systems, how we take it for granted that we can now eat, it is cheap enough to eat beef for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm hoping you guys don't do that, because I'd very much worry about your cardiologist having to have that, time with you. It's not good for you. But the fact that we can afford to do it is very worrying. That is not something that was there even our grandparents' generation. The Sunday roast was a sacred meal, right? The ability to eat meat that easily was actually for special occasions. In my family, it was for either weddings or birthdays or Sundays, the day we celebrated. And I go back into thinking about the way we eat our food, um, recognizing what are the biggest drivers, and then thinking about industrial farming, which has created the economies of scale that make food very cheap, but has led to a lot of ecological destruction. And so rechanging, and it's such a simple shift, which is valuing the food that we eat. And in fact, they say it in Laudato Si, doing grace before and thanking God after makes us realize how important a simple thing of the food that we have, where it comes from, what it took to get there. I sometimes imagine like just where it came from and the entire journey it took just to get to my plate. And I'm in awe of it. I mean, but and but what I would say is just thinking about that. Um, I'll say another thing is there's a service called Oddbox. So we have a lot of food waste in the UK. So Oddbox is a great way of taking vegetables or fruits that would not have made the grocery store list. We call it wonky vegetables or wonky fruits. So it doesn't fit the size requirements or the shape requirements of grocery stores, but is otherwise perfectly fine. You can become a customer. So you have a little bit of a surprise on what you get back in your Oddbox, but you essentially reduce food waste by creating that change. So that's a wonderful thing. I would think, I mean, that's one way. Another thing I would say is if you have a pension fund, ask your employers about your pension fund and where it's invested. In fact, the singular biggest climate impact that you could do is asking something as simple as your pension fund. Where does that money go towards? What is the climate risk impact that it goes towards? And one thing in what we've noticed is with the companies we've worked with, and it's been pretty big companies, it's common home brands. And one of the reasons, we've asked them, why are you shifting? Interestingly, it's not just external pressure, but it's internal pressure. They say a lot of people who are interviewing with them ask, what is your climate strategy? What do you do with pension funds? And they find that very smart, but it also makes them see that there's been a change in values. The third thing I would think about is how we try. I just genuinely think, like, thinking about our consumer habits, not just in the sense of its environmental impact, but what are we consuming? Why are we consuming it? And to what extent is it a reflection of, do we really need it? Is it really our values? And I think actually that's a very strong thing to ask, right? Like a lot of people are buying clothing, very cheap clothing, but that's disposable. But it goes into why. Like, why do we need to look like the latest celebrity? Why do we need to look at the stuff? Don't we know that we are precious in the way that we are? How do we, these kinds of things? I think that self-reflection helps think about what our values are and the way we want to live our lives. And then I would say the next thing is, something that a lot of people ask me is, how can I make a big impact in this world? And I just say, go and serve in a soup kitchen. It just changes things for you and you make an impact. The question is whether you want to be known for that impact, which is really the hidden thing that most people ask is that how, when they want to make impact, they want it to be known. but you will make a lot of impact by either making a difference, dedicating yourself something in your community. It doesn't have to be a soup kitchen. It can be just something that you care about, raking leaves, visiting the elderly, just something. But that kind of common care can then change in different ways. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I have a lot to say on that one.
No, I love that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria.
You're welcome.
Sometimes in the media, we always hear of people who seem to deny the climate change, deny the concept of climate change, especially from some people of our faith, who share our faith, who also has this denial in mind. Why do you think many people deny climate change, and particularly people of our faith that do so as well?
That's a great question, Mark. I'll say another reason why I'm really grateful for Laudatio Si is because it it gave a Catholic response to climate change, which is the science clearly corroborates it's true. It puts a clear line on what religion does and does not do. So religion does not. By the way, there are some brilliant climate scientists within the Catholic Church, but in terms of it acknowledges that science provides the evidence of how the climatic system is changing and what are the causes of that. What religion does very well is actually looking at our values and an internal perspective of what really is driving that in a way that I find a lot more compelling and beautiful because it's so much more intersected, but it goes to the heart of who we are as people. Now, in terms that, and that kind of answers the question of who we are as people, which is identity. I would say demographically, most people agree that climate deniers tend to be of an older generation, not all, but it tends to be of that. And I'm going to give, there is scientific evidence there's social scientific evidence that shows this, which is previously when you would see in the media climate denial, they would attack the science, because the science is actually quite easy to attack in that way, because there's so much uncertainty over when it's going to happen, what is the size of the impacts. You will see a big range. And so in that way, people were attacking the science because it doesn't provide more certainty of when, how big, that kind of thing. But now with successive IPCCs, when you have 3,000 of the world's scientists providing that peer-reviewed evidence, but you're starting to see these effects come through, it's harder to attack the science, but then it goes into what is the solution? And the solution is scary for a lot of people. It criticizes what I hate saying their generation, but it criticizes a way of life in a way that I think is really hurtful to them. And I can understand that, when I see Extinction Rebellion and I see the youth movement, I'm really proud of them because they managed to galvanize something that's so important. But when it comes to the conversation, I have a hard time seeing how shaking our fists at my parents, okay, so just to be very clear, I'm an oil brat. I grew up in Saudi Arabia and I grew up in Alberta. My parents both worked in the oil industry. Never once did I blame them, because at that time they didn't know better. And luckily my parents accept the climate science and they really accept that we have to do many things to decarbonize. But other uncles and aunts who worked in the oil industry, who I grew up with, it is a criticism to them. It is a criticism to their identity. And I imagine a lot of that generation. So there's something called the age of the Anthropocene. It's basically, what it means is scientists are contemplating calling a new geological era called the Anthropocene, which reflects that human beings have made such an impact on the Earth's natural systems that it requires its own geological age. And they're putting it at around 1950. So if you were to think about that, can you imagine that generation in 1950? Some people put it to 1815, the Industrial Revolution, but it's a straight critique on that generation, which in a lot of ways would think of themselves as a great generation. Like they've come out of the war, they've really been hardworking, they've helped their families grow up, and now a different generation is criticizing them. It's a hard thing to swallow. I would say that when you feel attacked, you're going to deny, and you're going to deny and underscore climate change as being, is it really as important? And a lot of times when I do have this conversation with my uncles and stuff, I mean, when I say uncles, like people who I grew up with in Saudi Arabia, they say, you have no idea what it took to come out of poverty. If we didn't have coal power stations, India would not have industrialized. And you have to remember that vantage point as well, that at their point of time, the need for international development was carbon intensive. And being criticized for that seems a bit unfair, though we recognize what it is about.
I've got another question here, Maria. So due to COVID, businesses are using lots of disposable items for food. How do we deal with this when they want to be COVID safe?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. It's kind of interesting because you suddenly realize the importance of plastics in order to, safeguard a lot of safety. And it goes back into this notion, like, people who created plastics weren't trying to be monsters. Their idea wasn't to plug our oceans full of plastic and to totally mess up those systems. They just were responding to a need for a type of material. What I would say is that actually it kind of goes back into, we're spending, this is not a good answer, but we are spending a lot more time in homes. What I find interesting is that through being at home, admittedly I have Oddbox, so that reduces my amount of plastic, and cooking with that, I reduce the amount of plastic I use in that way. But when I rely more on business to provide food, or that kind of service economy that isn't about me cooking or things like that, and there are legitimate reasons why people have to do that, I'm not saying that, but it again goes back into a lifestyle change. Could we rethink how we rethink our entire lifestyle that doesn't require that sort of dependence on businesses to deliver us food? But there's also movements within, so a lot of people will buy from supermarkets, and we definitely see plastic there. There is movement within that to reduce the amount of plastic. It's not maybe making the headway that we need, but that's my attempt at an answer.
Great. I think Edmund has a question for you.
Hi. Sorry, this is in ways a very specific question and also quite broad. I'm actually a geography undergraduate, and I've been studying a lot of stuff about global environmental politics this term, and it's been very focused on quite a lot of the things you've been mentioning about kind of environmental ethics and this idea of the Anthropocene, and it's really interesting kind of wading through the literature in the social sciences. But I've been struggling to kind of work through how to approach it from a position of someone of faith. And I guess the only thing I can ask is what can you say about that, about how to kind of approach these academic debates with the knowledge of everything else you've been saying? Yeah.
Actually, I kind of go back into this acknowledgement of that society is highly anxious, highly scared. It's very uncertain. Now, again, most social scientists will go into, they'll treat it as different types of problems. So loneliness will be under social development and psychology, breakdown of community relations. Consumerism and economic, so for us in geography, we would talk about economic development, consumerism, production. So that integration between economic systems and its impact on the environment. No one puts together what drives that sense of loneliness, individualism? Like, what is the impact of loneliness, individualism, what drives mass consumerism in such a way that then reworks an economic system? And I actually, like, the more I reflect on it, is what a person of faith would move into. I almost, it's really hard because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, but I go into why is there so much mass consumerism? What is the need for that? Like, where does that come from? Is it just marketing? Um, is it just, if we stop marketing, it solves the problem? Um, and it's so much within our culture and things like that, without a critique of what drives that. And I always find, I don't know if you'll find this, James, to go along, but I always find the social scientific explanation falls short. And it's not as integrated because it goes through different disciplines. The more I reflect on it, the more I feel as it comes back to this concept of sin. I am not saying that in your academic class to try to talk about sin in this way, but maybe it's just the way I found it is just acknowledging that there is brokenness in our society and opening up to what that brokenness is. I find that actually opens up a conversation of everyone can acknowledge there's something wrong. We can't put our finger on what that is, but when you open it up, surely it's like unpeeling a layer of that. But I always go into, why are we so driven for these things? And do we really think technological progress is enough and will solve all our climate problems? Do we really think that a more sustainable way of production will solve these problems? Will, what will solve loneliness? What will solve poverty? What will solve inequality? How do we bring that all together? Like, social science does try to bring all these things together. I find that just going into a space of why do all these problems occur, but kind of bringing it down to something as simple as, why is society so broken, but with a sense of hope. That seems to help. But I also genuinely say it comes from a sense of being, a way of being. So on people say I'm an irrepressible optimist, and that's why I'm a bit of a Pollyanna. I would just say that I'm a realistic optimist, where I can assess problems, I can understand why it occurs, but ultimately I do have hope in God. I do know that He can create conversions, and He can create reckonings, and He can create conversions, and it will bring out the better angels of our nature, even if in the short term we lose battles. It's it's not a very academic answer, but I find focusing on the brokenness and starting to bring these all things together helps as a starting point. If not, and I think having a conversation without necessarily needing to give people an answer and a theological answer is fine as well. I find more and more when people feel as if they're heard, they open up to you in a much more important way. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm more than happy to. I mean, there's a growing group of people who, like I said, the Economy of Francesco is a great way of engaging with that community, seeing how they speak about things, and then bringing it back. That could also be another really good way of showing that you can be a person of faith, but really approach these problems in a very galvanizing way, I would say.
Yeah, I wasn't really expecting an answer as such, but you give me quite a lot to think about, so that's good.
But I really do recommend looking at Economy of Francesco. I find it's a very interesting, not only interesting, very important movement. And it's not just for Catholics. He had given it to Pope Francis, had called anyone. But it is a great way to continue engaging with the community across, and it, like I said, it provides these intersections between different issues that I find very important and useful. And it takes you outside of the classroom as well.
Okay, thank you.
So usually we would sort of venture from one Zoom call to another and do some small group and conversation. But I think we could just stay in this group tonight and split maybe into a small group and have conversation. But I wonder if you have any questions that you could pose for us, Maria, as we entered that, so that we could think about and discuss. I know I've put you on the spot a little bit, but
What I'd really love for you to think about is just, I go back into, there's this sense of brokenness in society that a lot of people will put to different things, but I feel as if there is a common logos in there. Like there's a common sense of brokenness. And what I'd love for you to discuss is two things. And it is, in looking at that brokenness, how do you see Christ playing a role, whether it's into an interior conversion or your own interior conversion, actually? Like, how would you then go with that interior conversion to something you would want to do for others, to care for our common home? So if I just make it slowly, just like think about what brokenness you see around you. How does Christ provide you an interior conversion? How does even his message give you a sense of hope, to pay attention to others, to actually look at that brokenness? And what would that inspire you to do? That would be the question.